On December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had a couple of drinks. As Nestor is driving, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road, and so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. He looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, but when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. Nestor pulled up and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. He had to call a tow truck, but his phone was dead. So Nestor walks into the restaurant and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. He eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. It was a police officer who said, get out of the car. So Nestor, he gets out of the car, and Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer and how sorry he was. But the officer took his flashlight and immediately grabbed his radio, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car. And when he looked, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. The reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated.